people were thought to be in a busy shopping centre in central Ukraine when a missile struck. At least 10 people have been killed and 40 others injured. James Rushton is an independent security analyst based in Kyiv.
The building is in an inferno at this point. First responders doing the best that they can to tend to the wounded. It's a pretty grim scene, and like he said, apparently 1,000 people inside, or around about 1,000 people, and the number of victims, in his words, are unimaginable.
NATO has plans to increase the number of troops on high alert from 40,000 to 300,000. Allies are due to meet in Madrid this week, where they'll make it clear Russia is the alliance's most significant and direct threat. The Foreign Secretary hasn't said which body will decide whether legislation which would change part of the post-Brexit trade deal is legal. MPs are now debating the Northern Ireland Protocol in the Commons ahead of a vote tonight. Liz Truss says, though, it was very clear that it wasn't set in stone when it was first negotiated. And Los Angeles FC have confirmed the signing of Wales captain Gareth Bale. He's moved to the Major League Soccer club on a one-year contract. LBC Markets report the FTSE 100's closed at 49 points at 72.58. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.15. LBC weather: more rain and unsettled conditions, particularly for Northern Ireland and Scotland. Clear elsewhere with a low of 9. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:01 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. On the panel with me are Baroness Angela Smith, Labour's leader in the House of Lords, former MP for Basildon; Gina Miller, Transparency campaigner and leader of the True and Fair Party; Peter Bone, the Conservative MP for Wellingborough; and Gordon Rayner, Associate Editor of the Daily Telegraph. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to them, 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 and watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Have we missed a bit off your constituency name there, Peter?
It's Wellingborough. It's Wellingborough and Rushton, I call it, but Wellingborough is officially...
Oh, right, OK. I won't feel guilty then to the good burgers of Rushton. Right, let's go to the first question. It's Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Iain and panel. Yeah, and the question is, would it be a good idea for Labour and the Lib Dems to vote tactically in the next general election?
Well, we clearly saw a bit of that going on, certainly in Tiverton and Honiton, didn't we? Gina Miller, are you a fan of tactical voting?
Well, I did start a tactical voting website
That's
in
why I've come to you
2017
first.
and also before the last election. But things have changed under the Elections Act. So I think now it's going to be up to voters rather than the parties to decide on pacts. And I think it is right that it's up to the voters. I think people can, if third parties want to provide information, I think it's up to voters to decide. Parties set out their stall and people can decide how they want to vote.
But there did seem to be at least a tacit understanding, didn't there?
But that was amongst voters. I think that was amongst voters in both Wakefield and Tiverton and Honiton. I think for different reasons, and the turnout was definitely 39% was very different to 52% in Tiverton. But voters, I think, in Tiverton sent a strong protest vote, and in Wakefield, I don't know if there was an unofficial understanding or not, but it was very interesting that both Labour losing their deposit in Tiverton and Lib Dems in Wakefield. That was pretty unusual. So it does seem to signal some sort of a understanding, official or unofficial. But I still think it came from the voters.
Do you not think that starting a new party actually doesn't help this process? If the aim is to get the Tories out, what you've done is effectively muddy the waters a bit.
No, because as I said, we will set our stall out and it'll be up to voters. If we think we have something to offer, which is a democratic choice for us to launch a party, and if people like what we've got to say, then they'll vote for us. If they don't, they won't.
Peter Bone.
Well, there was tactical voting, clearly, and there was an understanding. The fact that the party not campaigning lost its deposit was a clear indication. In my constituency, a few weeks ago, there was a by-election in one of the safest Conservative wards. In fact, we increased our share of the vote. We lost the seat. because all the Labour voters switched to Liberal Democrats and Labour didn't. Now, I think in a by-election, you can do that. But when you're choosing a government, I'm not sure, well, if the Liberals are silly enough to go along with Labour, I think...
Well, few for long enough, didn't they?
No. No, can I just ask you? Do you think that was good for the Liberals going along with this?
Certainly not.
I think that's my point. Yeah. If the Liberals want a clear message, they can't do that at a general election because they would just become the add-on to Labour.
This is nothing new, though, is it? When the Liberal Democrats, the seat I fought in North Norfolk back in 2005, the Liberal Democrats won that seat originally by persuading Labour voters to effectively lend them their votes. And, of course, they held on to it for a very long time because of that. And it was only in 2019 that the Conservatives actually got it back. So this is nothing new. It's not a new phenomenon, is it?
No, it's not a new phenomenon. And we're at a mid-term by-elections, which tells us absolutely nothing about what's going to happen in the general election.
You aren't worried by those two results at all?
Well, I'm not worried. I think I think there were two different results. I think that in Tiverton, Conservatives were switching to Liberal Democrats to send a message to the government. They certainly won't vote Liberal Democrat in the general election. In Wakefield, Labour should have been doing an awfully lot better. I mean, in Tony Blair's day, there were being Conservatives switching to Labour. That just didn't happen. And if you look at the opinion polls, what are we?
Well, it must have happened a bit because you went from a majority of 3,000 to a deficit of 6.
Yeah, but look at what happened with the Liberal Democrat vote there. It completely disappeared and went clearly to Labour. And it seems to me if we're only 2, 3, 6 points behind in the opinion polls at this stage, I think the party that ought to be worried is Labour, and I think they are worried. And a lot of Labour MPs are very concerned what's going to happen with their leadership.
Are you worried, Angela?
Well, I think it's hilarious of Peter. The Conservative Party has done badly in 2 significant by-elections, and he says it's the Labour Party that should be worried. I thought Wakefield was better than we were given a lot of credit for, to be honest, because when I look back at previous figures for Wakefield, this is the biggest majority in numbers, given particular low turnout, than there has been for something like 15 or so years, and the biggest percentage majority for nearly 20 years. So it was a pretty good result. I also don't think political parties can tell their voters to vote for somebody else. They're not going to listen to political parties. People make their own choices at election time. Parties put their resources where they've got the most effort, most support likely to come up. So if we were to say to our people, you must vote Lib Dem, or the Lib Dem said you must vote Labour, ballot box is a private place. You cannot tell your supporters to vote for somebody else, and we shouldn't do. But I think voters are getting a bit more canny. And as you say, it's been going on for years. There have been times where voters got it wrong in tactical voting. I remember back in the day, as you would say, when the Basildon seat divided into 2 and David Amess won, partly because lots of people thought voting tactically meant voting for the SDP, and so the Labour vote sunk in that constituency as well in others, where actually a tactical vote there would have been Labour. So people sometimes get it wrong.
And then David made it into a very safe seat. He became... Mr. Basildon, didn't
that was the seat. That was the seat that he won with the SDP vote, and he held on to it until I came along in 1997.
Where he won, I think he won Southend, West End.
Well, yes, which I'd fought previously, back and forward. So
and I used to live there. So.
We're going to do the nerdy Essex stuff here. But yeah, I think people make up their own minds, but nobody party can direct their voters what to do. They will make up their minds what they see. I mean, interested in Honeston and Devon, just the Honeston seat, the Lib Dems came second, even in 1997, which was a Labour high point. The Lib Dems came second, but they paid a very high price, as Peter alluded to just now, for being in coalition with the Conservatives, and their vote slumped. So it's only just picked up. So in 1997, they were really serious challengers to the Conservatives, but paid a price for the coalition government.
I was going to say on the doorsteps, what we're finding is a lot of Conservative voters are using a different term. They're saying they're willing to lend their vote rather than tactically vote.
They always say that, yeah.
But it's really interesting that it's more coming from Conservatives on the doorstep than anyone else that we're hearing.
Gordon Rayner.
Well, to go back to your question, Martin, would it be a good idea for Labour and Lib Dem voters to vote tactically? Well, it depends what you're trying to achieve. If what you're trying to achieve is just simply getting rid of the Conservatives, then yes, that probably will achieve that. But what it's also likely to achieve is a coalition government. And you need to think very carefully, or voters need to think very carefully before they start voting tactically, if a coalition government is what they want. Because if they are Labour voters and they vote tactically for the Lib Dems, and you get a very strong Lib Dem showing, and you have Lib Dems effectively wagging the dog, well, you can't complain about that because that was what you voted for.
But do you think there would be another coalition government? I think the Lib Dems would run a mile from coalition after what happened last time. You may get arrangements on certain issues, but I don't think either party came out well of the coalition, really.
Well, in which case you just have a very weak minority government, don't you? Which isn't good for the...
Demand.
I mean, given
Which
the
is
Lib
what they've
Dems
said
actually
yesterday.
got 75% of their manifesto through the coalition years, I always thought it was a tactical mistake from the Lib Dems to sort of say, I'm really sorry, we shouldn't have done that, because they actually achieved most of their aims.
But they're also very loyal to the Conservatives. I remember votes in the House of Lords where, I have to say, there were some Conservatives who weren't going to vote, but the Lib Dems trotted through. So I think it was a mixed time. And then when they went into opposition, as they clearly were going to, they've tried to sort of be more left-wing, shall we say, to try and sort of atone for their sins in government. It's a strange party because you've got such a coalition of people.
Is that the best
Liberal
way of atoning
Democrats.
for sins, be a bit more left-wing?
Well, I think some of them think it is. But we know how left-wing you are, so you wouldn't actually fall for that one, would you?
No, definitely not. Martin, thank you very much for that. A follow-up text question from Simon in Barnes, who says, if 3 more Tory MPs are considering defecting to Labour, like the reports tonight are saying, does this show that Boris isn't in charge of his party anymore? Would you like to enlighten us, Peter Bone, as to whether you might be one of these 3 MPs?
Well, it's a very nice offer for St Keir, but I don't actually think I'm going to take it up. And also, I don't think there's a single Conservative that's going to defect. But
where do these rumours come from? Because it's...
I think you should ask Angela that, because I'm pretty sure it comes from the Labour Party.
There are a lot of Tory MPs who are not very happy with Boris Johnson at the moment, but being unhappy and defecting to another party are 2 different things, aren't they?
Yeah, look, I've been in the Conservative Party since I was 15, and the many times I didn't agree with what our leader was doing. I had to put up with John Major, and then I had to put up with Theresa May and the Brexit thing. I fought for what I believed in, and ultimately we won. And now we've got a Prime Minister who's, in my view, getting things right, getting the big calls right, if you like.
Gordon?
I don't think defecting to another party is ever a good look, is it? I think it smacks of desperation. I think if you don't agree with the policies of your leader, then you need to either try and change that from within, or, as we've seen before, you could then become an independent MP. I suspect that's more likely to happen than people crossing the floor. But I think switching to the other side just because you think that you might win at the next election, or what are you going to do? Switch back if things aren't going your way? It's not for me.
Because there were a lot of defections in the last Parliament, Gina. Weren't there?
There were. But I think one of the things I'd say about, at the moment, that rumour tonight is there are an awful lot of rumours coming out from all sorts of different departments and weekend press. And I do wonder who it is that's leaking all these things. Is it the opposition? Is it the party themselves? There just seems to be so much misdirection going on and dead cats being thrown all over the place at the moment. I wonder if this is now the new play of politics. And I think it's really upsetting for voters, and it's really not fair that people have to sort of second-guess what's going on. I think politics shouldn't be conducted like this.
We've had 2 MPs, Caroline Noakes, who's been a big critic of Boris Johnson, and Hannah Davison, both denying that they are likely suspects in this. And I suspect, certainly in the case of Caroline Noakes, she would have been one of the suspects if it were true, but she says it absolutely...
But it's almost forcing them to deny it. That's what I mean. There's so many games and bullying and things happening. I think it's a disgraceful way to conduct politics.
But surely this isn't going to come from the Conservative Party, is it? I mean, what would be the logic of that? Surely it's coming from Labour, who want to sort of throw a few pebbles in the political pond. Because if it did happen, they've already had one, Christian Wakeford. Yes. If it did happen, it would be a massive political coup. So you can understand the logic from Labour's point of view, Angela.
Can, but my experience of defections is that nobody talks about them. They're very, very hush-hush. No one knew Christian Wakeford was going to go to the Labour Party. A few people would have done. You protect people who are wanting to defect. There's normally a number of meetings. I can remember my time as an MP where I can think of 3 defections. And it's quite a dramatic moment if somebody gets up and walks across the floor, I have to say. But it's difficult for people. I remember talking to 2 of those who defected sometime later, who came to the Labour Party, I said it must have been really difficult because your social circle, your friends, people who trust you to walk across the floor. And two of them said to me it'd been much harder to stay. It'd been in my mind for a long time. But they hadn't spoken to anyone. So I doubt this is a Labour Party spin, because you would just keep very quiet about it, so as not to alert the Tory whips that there could be two people on their way.
Because you're right. If it was true, it wouldn't be heard of. The fact it's spin, it's because that's what Labour wants to try and destabilise the government. And that's what it is. You know it is.
No, I don't at all, because we wouldn't do that. No, you don't. What you don't do is give any hint that you've got people coming over.
That's why I don't think anyone is coming over.
No, it may well be. I don't know. What I'm saying is, I think this comes from some journalists and some people who think they're in the know. It would not be an official leak from the Labour Party to say, we think we might have. Having said that, we do have lots of people talking to us about their own dissatisfaction. You haven't got to meet many Tory MPs or scratch too far to get a whole litany of complaints they have and how unhappy they are.
Let's see if we can scratch Peter Bone in the break, shall we? And see.
Yeah, it's a big leap.
Sorry about that image for you all. But,
yes.
Right, we will take more of your calls and texts in a moment. Simon, thank you very much for your text. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
18 minutes past 8. We have Baroness Angela Smith with us, Gina Miller, Peter Bone and Gordon Rayner. Chris is in Stubbington, has our next call. Hello, Chris. Hi, go ahead.
Oh, hello. In light of the Roe v. Wade being overturned, can America now still call itself the land of the free when it's taken away abortion rights for women?
Gina Miller.
I mean, it's absolutely shocking that this has happened. I think the ramifications of this are only just beginning. To take away the right of a woman to have a say over her own body and her own health. That health right is an extraordinary erosion. But as I said, I think it's just the beginning, because they're already starting to talk about limiting contraception and possibly gay marriage. This is something that we saw coming, and we were very frightened about, all of those of us who believe in freedoms and protecting rights, is that there is a movement, a very extreme Christian movement or religious movement in the US that's now captured both the Supreme Court and the chambers. And I think this is incredibly damaging, because what it will mean is that women, particularly of lower economic backgrounds, have going to be taken away. The choices are going to be taken away from them. And the ramifications for those who are either victims of rape or sex, there are no exceptions to this new law, which is basically barbaric.
Have I not got this right, that the Supreme Court are basically devolving these decisions down to state level, so it'll be up to the individual states to decide
So far, there's
what to do?
8 states, but they are talking, there are already rumours of it actually overriding that and bringing it in all states to doing federal law. There are rumours of that. I do believe it's the beginning. It's the beginning of the erosion of rights that have been fought and won over hundreds of years.
Gordon Rayner.
Well, I would have to agree with Gina, and I think that if it was men that had to carry babies, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. I think that abortion the abortion laws would have stayed as they were if it wasn't for the fact that these are laws that affect women that are very often being made by men.
Angela?
Well, I think it's desperately sad. This won't stop abortions, but it will significantly reduce the number of safe abortions. And women will be in danger. And you're right, in a sense they have devolved it to states because there's no right to an abortion. That's now been removed, and states will make decisions. And you'll find women travelling who can afford to, you'll find unsafe abortions. It's going to be, I think, something that is going to hit America quite hard. And it's quite interesting to see the public opinion in America. This doesn't have overwhelming public support.
No, it doesn't, because you look at all the polls and they show that the majority of Americans do believe in abortion rights.
No, it's got judges are actually overruling personal choice.
Well, it's Trump's judges. Trump knew what he was doing when he tell the Supreme Court works, isn't it? It's the president gets to choose the Supreme Court.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? You have political appointees, and let's not pretend that Donald Trump was the only one to make political appointments to the Supreme Court. Peter Bone.
Well, thankfully, we don't have the American system. We don't have the Supreme Court effectively making decisions like this. Parliament here is sovereign. I don't see any problem of devolving rights to the states. Presumably the states will reflect the opinion of the people in those states. But I don't know enough about American politics. If you ask me in this country, am I in favour of abortion? I don't like abortion. But that's not to say that all abortions should be ruled out. And I just think...
Well, that's the direction of travel here, isn't it?
Mm. Well, what, here?
No, sorry, in America.
Yeah, I mean... I just don't know enough about how it does. But it doesn't seem in principle that if you're devolving to another elected authority, i.e. the states, to decide, why they would do something different to what their voters want. And if their voters want abortion, you would think they would be... So I'm quite strange how these states are suddenly changing things if their voters don't want it.
They've not changed them yet, but the automatic right to an abortion, the constitutional right to abortion has now gone. So states will make the decisions. And what we're finding is that some states that have the Conservative, the Republican majorities have already said they are going to remove that right in those states. So you'll end up with 1 or 2 states that still provide abortion.
But 28 so far.
Yeah, said they wouldn't. Yeah.
But are you against the principle of basically letting local states decide?
Well, on the constitutional rights, local states don't decide, but they've taken away the constitutional right. That's why it's now going back to states.
I think, thank goodness, we don't have a written constitution.
Agree on that one.
What about there's also been an argument over the past few days about the terminology here, where traditionally we've all talked about pro-choice and pro-life, and yet I gather the BBC now have told all of their reporters that they're not allowed to use the term pro-life anymore. They have to use anti-abortion, which... I mean, it's true in the sense of how they describe it, but are we getting to a point where there is such an acceptance on abortion rights in this country that no one's allowed to question it anymore? And if you are of a devout religious background, that you're almost supposed to be quiet about your views on so-called pro-life issues?
I don't think you have got to be quiet. I mean, That's taking it to an extreme that I don't think is necessary. I think the whole point is we should have debates, because then it does go underground. And that's one of the things I think we've seen in the past, is we do have to have open debates and freedom of speech, because that actually ultimately defends rights and speech. Because if you're hiding in the background and you're behind closed doors having these debates, and you're only talking to people who agree with you or you agree with, and you're echo chambering, then that can lead to a very different place. But I don't really understand the necessity of doing it. It's a strange decision.
But I think sometimes these labels put people in different categories. I would describe myself as pro-life, but I do support a woman's right to an abortion. The pro-life term can be abused as well. So I think it gets into difficult areas. Make sure what we're talking about, people understand the purpose of language is communication.
But pro-life and pro-choice, sort of summarise it. The pro-choice is the woman has the right to decide. Pro-life, people who support that view, and I tend to be in that category, think that the baby at conception is a human being and that has a right to life. And therefore, I'm very surprised that the BBC is changing that, because everyone talks about pro-life and pro-choice, don't they?
Are you surprised? Not sure I am.
Well, I'm disappointed. Better.
Do you think, though, that this might open up a much bigger argument in this country? Because we've had, abortion law in this country has been settled essentially for a very long time. You have arguments around the margins about term limits from time to time, but they tend to be dominated by medical advancement. It's totally different, the argument here, compared to the United States. And given that we are supposedly similar countries, I've never understood why it's become such a totemic issue among the Christian right in America, whereas it really hasn't here. Is this a big issue for your readers, Gordon, on the Telegraph?
I think it very often divides down religious lines, doesn't it? So I think that part of the reason that it's become such a, as you say, such a sort of totemic issue in America is that they are a much more religious society than we are here, and a much more sort of fundamental society in terms of their religious beliefs. We're not that country. But yes, it is something which Telegraph readers, I think, a lot of them have very strong views on. But to go back to Gina's point and the point you were making, it's not something that you should be banned from debating, partly because there are an awful lot of issues within the debate. It's not just a case of whether abortion is legal or not. As we've said, it's about term limits. It's about whether women who've been raped in America, they want to ban people having abortions if they've conceived incestuously, perhaps an incestuous. These are matters that you should be able to talk about. So I agree with Gina that we need to be able to have these debates without getting too emotional and without getting too angry. And I think the problem is that it's a very angry debate in America.
But we've had the debate recently here because Northern Ireland legislation has been different to the rest of the UK. And I spent last Tuesday, as I've done on a number of occasions over the last 2 or 3 years, looking at the abortion laws in Northern Ireland and bringing them to line with the UK, which the government has acted on in the interest of human rights. So I had a sense of the debate, and people feel this very deeply. I think people should be allowed to express their views. That's the right thing. But at the end of the day, you have to have a common sense, decent law that provides for particularly the kind of circumstances that we've been talking about.
Can I just say on the other point on this that I find extraordinary when I do talk to some people who support it, is this idea that women make this decision lightly and that there isn't a huge amount of advice and medical intervention and support networks around before you come to that decision. I've been in that situation being a much older mother and had to have that discussion with my daughter because there were all sorts of complications. And there is a huge amount of information out there, and it is not an easy choice. I was lucky to be in a position that financially I could support, but other people might make a different decision. But it's not a decision that's taken lightly, and that's one of the things I think is really upsetting about this debate, is that somehow it's used. I've even heard people say it's used as a form of contraception. No, it is not. So we've got to take away some of the stigma of this being a lightly made decision by women. It's not.
Do you fear, though, that what's happened in America is going to galvanise the forces in this country?
I absolutely think that, and I think we're seeing that in other areas of society as well. It's not just in abortion law. And, they all saying whatever happened to America 10 years later, we suffer the same. But I think there is a movement, and it's not just in America and the UK. There is a movement in Western cultures and democracies towards more fundamentalist, sort of, if you want to say, views.
Well, it's not just Western cultures. much, isn't it?
Views, yes, and I think, yeah, that we are seeing more extreme views.
At the bottom line, it has to be a public health issue. As I think I said very early on, this isn't going to stop abortions taking place, but it will stop safe abortions taking place, and that's a very dangerous.
And would you accept that, Peter?
We're going back to what I have no idea what's going to happen in America. I go back to the logic is presumably if you live in Texas, and whatever decision Texas makes will be what the people in Texas want. And I'm not going to tell the Americans how to. I mean, in this country, we've always debated this, and we've always had a free vote on it, and I think that's the right way. I think, was it Lord Steele that brought in has regretted what has happened over the years and the number of abortions. So there are arguments to be had, and I do say that there is a point where there is a baby. And I don't think there is the argument that baby has a right to life. And that argument, you may say it's Christian, but I think as a Christian, I think that's a perfectly fair thing. But in this country, we've, as you're rightly saying, we've sort of, I won't say compromise, but we've come to agreement. When does life start?
We've been pragmatic, haven't we?
Yeah, and yes, because medical science is better, babies survive at an earlier age. We've moved the weeks, and I think most people sort of support that.
I think what's interesting is how the law in Ireland changed, and one of the things that led to the change was a young woman who needed to have a termination. Her life was at risk, and she couldn't have that termination, and she died. And there was this huge debate in Ireland, and they conducted it, I think, in a very sensible way. All voices were heard, the very point you were making earlier. And they came to the conclusion that abortion should be allowed. And so it's a baby's life. There's a mother's life at stake as well, in many cases. So I think if the Irish government could organise such a debate in such a sensible, pragmatic, decent way, then it would be nice to see the America behaving in the same way, perhaps even in the States as well.
Good luck with that. Thank you very much, Chris in Stubbington. We'll come to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC with Serena Farrow.
At least 10 people have been killed and 40 others injured in a missile strike on a shopping centre in Ukraine. The Prime Minister says the attack in Kremenchuk shows the depth Vladimir Putin will sink to. NATO plans to significantly step up its defence strategy in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It plans to make the biggest overhaul to its defences since the Cold War, when allies meet in Madrid this week. And MPs are debating the Northern Ireland Protocol in the Commons ahead of a vote tonight. Many, though, feel that it unilaterally overriding parts of the trading agreement would be a breach of international law. LBC weather, more rain and unsettled conditions, particularly for Northern Ireland and Scotland. Elsewhere, staying pretty clear with a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:35 on LBC. Welcome back to Cross Question. Angela Smith is with us, Gina Miller, Peter Bone and Gordon Rayner. They're answering your calls on 0345 6060 973. Chris is in Croydon. Hi, Chris.
Well, good evening, and good evening, panel. My question is this. Which is in the greater public interest, a pay increase for criminal barristers or another 40,000 prison places?
Is it either or?
No.
So which would you go for then?
Prison places myself.
OK. Peter Bone.
I don't know a lot about the barrister strike. I think there was the only thing I saw was from a former Labour candidate as a barrister spouting on the steps of some court. But I'm afraid I just don't know the details of it. As for building new prisons in Wellingborough, we have, I think, the newest prison in the country, which is the standard for the rest, and we welcomed it in Wellingborough, and I think if we need more prisons, we should build them.
Do you not feel you ought to be across the criminal barrister strike, given today was the first day of it? I mean, their beef is that they haven't had a pay rise in, I think, more than 15 years. They've been offered 15%, which on the face of it sounds rather generous until you learn what they actually earn.
Yeah, and it does look ridiculously low, and I've been lobbied in the past by barristers. And the problem is there are some very rich barristers.
But not criminal barristers.
But the criminal barristers who turn up in the middle of the night to go and look after someone are the ones that are not getting paid fairly. Now, the government's got to sort this out. 15% seems a good starting place. But it would be wrong for me to say, well, the barrister's right, the government's right. I just don't know enough about it.
Gordon.
Well, if there aren't any criminal barristers, then there won't be any trials, and there won't be there won't be any need for the prison places, will there? So I suppose, self-evidently,
don't give the government ideas.
I think, look, as Peter said, some barristers do get paid very well, but criminal barristers tend to be on quite modest incomes. There's a supply and demand issue here. I think if they are so poorly paid that they decide to move into other aspects of the law, which they're perfectly free to do.
And not only that, they're going out of the law. That's the problem.
Yeah, so you're going to end up with too few barristers. You will have trials that will be delayed for longer and longer because there won't be people to represent people. And so, as I say, the prison places will be empty because there'll just be a huge backlog of trials.
Angela.
I was going to make the same point, actually. At the moment, there's 58,000 cases in the backlog. And I suppose most people will think of, watch TV and see some very well-paid barrister on TV. The likelihood is that the barristers that do a lot of the work, as the point Peter made, aren't well paid, and they don't get paid for going to and from the court or the police station. They don't get paid for taking the evidence. They don't get paid for doing preparation. It's... so you're talking about an average salary, I think I saw something earlier, it could be sort of £12,000, £15,000 they're being paid. So some of them will go on to earn big money later on, but a lot won't. This all goes back to 2013 when the government cut the money, the coalition government cut the money for legal aid. And now we're finding these huge backlogs in cases, barristers leaving the profession.
I don't think the backlog is also a bit due to COVID as well.
It could well be,
I think that would be
I think there were 39,000 cases before COVID, so it is part of it.
But you've had barristers leaving the profession since it was cut in 2013, and all that's had an impact. Barristers, like politicians, aren't going to get much sympathy for the public. What we do need to have is a properly funded criminal justice system. We've lost something like 40% of our courts have been closed as well. So people who have to go to court are travelling much greater distances, so people miss court cases. Number of court cases that fall because somebody hasn't turned up, because they've had to go so much further. There's been a transport problem. So it's all in a bit of a mess. There was the report that was supposed to sort all this out. If the government looks at the recommendations, pay is part of that and will help with the problem. But as we said, we're not going to need prison places if we're not going to have people going through the courts.
And apparently the man who wrote the report has miraculously been elevated to the House of Lords. Yeah, I mean, it's strange that, isn't it?
Not in my side, he's not, so I haven't seen him yet.
Isn't he? No, he can't be because he's now a Justice Minister as well, Lord Bellamy.
He came in the other week. Yeah, I think he's the third or fourth Justice Minister in as many years. They keep losing them because they don't like what the government's doing and they resign, and so they have to get somebody else.
Gina.
I think the whole justice system is vastly underfunded, from police to courts to court staff to legal aid to criminal barristers. The whole system was cut, and we have got to think seriously. And unfortunately, as a policy area, justice tends to slip down the agenda, and because it's just seen as not something, it doesn't affect people's lives. It affects everybody's lives. Access to justice is a fundamental part of a functioning society. And I think we do have to think about how we really start to overhaul and fund it. Because, a lot of the criminal justice, I have to say, I thought about becoming a criminal barrister, and when I saw the pay and the conditions, I wasn't particularly attracted. But we have got to have, if you look, I say that there is, from a female point of view, we were talking about abortions earlier, but, from access to justice for women, when you look at the low levels of rape trials and violent assault, and we need to have a society that has access to justice, and that's not happening at the moment. And we have got to change this narrative of demonising lawyers and demonising professions and demonising experts, because at the end of the day, we all need them. So this is not just about funding the justice service, it's about elevating them as well to be respected parts of our community.
Chris, thank you very much for that question. Let's move on to a text question from Colin in York, who says Russia is still committing vile atrocities in Ukraine. So when the PM goes to NATO tomorrow, how will he defend cutting back our military? And this is something we're going to be talking about after 9 o'clock on the programme, because Labour have called for an end to defence cuts. Gordon Rayner.
Well, there are some suggestions that he's not going to defend cutting back the military, that he's going to at least talk about the idea that he may increase defence spending. So I guess we have to wait and see. I do think that there is a difficulty here, because even if we don't increase the size of our own armed forces, I think we have to commit to spending money on weapons that we can send to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves. And I don't know how much that's going to cost in the long term, because obviously nobody knows how long the war will go on for. But I do think we have to have a very firm commitment that what the Ukrainians need, we will help supply.
And, I mean, the argument about defence cuts is a bit hackneyed, isn't it? Because we can't fight the last war. We can't fight a war as if it was in 1963 or 1982. The ways of fighting wars now are very different. You don't necessarily need an army of X thousand. You don't necessarily need thousands of tanks. I mean, I say this knowing absolutely nothing about it, but that's what I keep reading.
I don't know if you're talking to John Healey later about
I don't know, actually.
his work he's doing. Hope you are. But he also produced a report a few months back that looked at how money has been spent by the MOD, and could this be better spent. So I think there's 2 or 3 things. One, we have seen quite significant cuts in the armed forces and defence spending. Secondly, how the money's been spent, if it's been wisely spent. I think some of the procurement is something absolutely. We would question enormously. But thirdly, on the defence review, we took our eye off the ball for Europe. If you look at the defence review the government did, 2-3 years ago, the emphasis isn't in Europe or stability in Europe. That was taken for granted, and it all moved across to Asia, the Pacific, and what we needed to do there. And actually, the threat was on the doorstep. And so I think...
I don't think we were alone in analysing that.
Not saying we are, but when you do a defence review, you do sort of watch your back door as well as seeing where the future dangers are. So I think there's 3 elements of this. And John Healey, our Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, has been really looking at it in some detail. So I think it's hard to defend cutbacks that have been made, and there have been a lot of them. One of the things we have in the House of Lords, a lot of ex-military people, and it's quite illuminating listening to them, because they're not somebody saying you just got to throw more money at it. They've actually got quite a reasoned argument, and we've had the debates on the Ukraine, their take of how we should have done things, how we could have done things differently, and how the military response to Ukraine has been the right one, but it was the lead up to that we weren't as alert and watching what was happening as we should have been.
Peter Bone.
I think I disagree with most of that. We've been leading Europe with the amount of money we put in defence as part of NATO. It's the other NATO countries that haven't been carrying their share of it. And it's the most important issue we've got. There is a war in the middle of Europe between the West and Russia. Russia want to establish a greater Russia, and perhaps the French will have suggested we give a bit of Ukraine territory for a temporary peace. That would be wrong. I think Boris has led...
Church of England has suggested that as well.
Well, then in case that proves that is incredibly wrong. Yes, they're defecting onto the Church of England because... But the truth of the matter is, this is the thing that affects everyone. We are not going to go back to a situation like it was. There's not going to be an end to the war and everything's going to be fine in Europe again. There's going to be the Russian bloc and there's going to be the Western bloc.
So, Peter, what part of what I said do you disagree with?
No, I'm just saying that this is the most important issue we've got, and I don't think people have understand this. I don't think perhaps the government has explained this well enough. We are in an extraordinarily dangerous position, and we haven't been cutting defence spending. What we've been doing is changing how the money is spent. And you can argue whether that's right or wrong, but I listened to the Secretary of State for Defence saying quite clearly that the threat of a Russian invasion was a significant part of the defence review. So I think what we should be saying is, and I would, of course, as a Conservative, argue we should spend more on defence, but I also think European neighbours have got to step up to the plate. We were in there first with Ukraine. We were giving them defence equipment. We've been the ones pushing all the time to support them. And I don't think anyone can doubt that. And I if anything keeps me awake at night, is this war in Europe.
It's interesting. Excuse me. I was reading today comments from a Russian military supposed expert who said, well, let us be in no doubt that if this war escalates, London will be the first to be bombed. Now, that's quite stark, and OK, this is just one Russian military commentator, but this is not the first time that we've heard this sort of thing. How much should our entire defence strategy, our defence spending be geared towards that kind of talk? And how much should we be spending on counter-defence rather than necessarily just the usual things that we spend money on? Gina?
It's really interesting. It's not my subject. I've been reading up, trying to read on it, and I agree it is one of the most important issues for us to talk about because the geopolitical implications of Russia coming deeper and deeper into Europe is unthinkable. But the idea of how you spend money, I think going back to Angela's issue on procurement, is really important because a lot of what I've read is that there has been huge waste and conflicts of interest and sort of a waste of the defence budget when it comes to procurement. But I do think we have got to think long and hard about threats and being proactive in defending our country and not just defending abroad. And I think, one of the things that I heard one of the chiefs, a very senior army person saying yesterday was that, we haven't got, and it's not just us, the NATO countries either, we don't have huge stocks of armaments. We don't actually have, there is a worry about how long we can carry on supporting Ukraine if this carries on for a year, 2 years, 3 years, because we haven't been actually funding our defence in a way that means that we have that luxury, if you like, of supporting Ukraine. We must do. But the other thing I'd say about NATO is I'm a bit alarmed at how much of a lead the US is taking on Ukraine and NATO. I think the other NATO members, as are at the moment, and I hope tomorrow, and going forward this week, should actually be much more bold in the way they're standing up to the US.
To the US?
Yeah, I think they need to be much bolder because the US is actually driving too much of this, in my view.
Well, who else is going to drive it if the US doesn't?
Well, I think more of the other member states should be. I think there should be more of a collective sort of a process in NATO than just waiting for US to act.
OK, we'll take more of your calls in just a moment. It's 8:49.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary of State George Eustice. The Daily Mirror reports Labour saying there could be at least half a dozen Conservative colleagues ready to defect to Sir Keir Starmer's party. Are you aware of these revolting Conservatives?
I haven't heard that, no. And who knows, it could just be a bit of tittle-tattle coming from somebody on the Labour benches, or it may be more real.
Would you be distracted, though, about the results you suffered last week? Surely you need to take action on that.
We've got 2 years to get things back on track, and that's what we're going to focus on doing. And if we can do that, in a year, 18 months' time, things could look and feel very different.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Everyone's
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Angela Smith, Gina Miller, Peter Bone and Gordon Rayner with us taking your calls. Let's go to Lenny in Ashford, who's got a bit of a different kind of question. Hi, Lenny.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. One thing I would like to ask, can the panel name anything that is fit for purpose in our country?
See, I think this is a really interesting question because we used to be a country with a reputation for being a little bit boring, where things kind of worked. We all got along and rubbed along and the systems kind of worked with the odd exception. And yet now, nothing seems to work. Why is that? Gina?
Well, I'm going to say it's the True and Fair Party. That's exactly why we came into being, because when we look at the landscape, we see systemic failure everywhere we look, be it from the FCA to education to housing to social care, disability allowance. I don't know how we got here, but the thing is we've got to fix it. And that's the path. We've got to think about how we fix it. But I think part of the reasons, I'd say maybe threefold. One is that we've been running our country on the cheap for the last 12 years. There's been so much cutting of public services, in education. We talked about justice, prisons, wherever you look. We have been cutting back on investment. And the economy, we have not had a growth economy, which has also not produced enough money so that we can actually grow our country and sustain systems at work. And the third thing I'd say is conflicts of interest. I think we have a disastrous lack of transparency when it comes to those who are at the top of our institutions, and that is part of the systemic failure too.
Gordon Rayner.
Well, I'm tempted to say the England cricket team and Emma Raducanu after today. But look, I think we live in an era of 24-hour media, and I'm part of it. I think we are very good at criticising everything in this country. That's a good thing.
Even your Telegraph website doesn't work for me anymore.
Well,
it's got this. Get your 3 months free.
You have to pay for it.
I have paid for it, but this thing comes up.
It does all the time.
There's nothing to get rid of it, and I can't get into the site. So sort it, please.
I'll take it up. I'll take it with the powers that be. Look, I spend quite a lot of time with people who work in the armed forces, and we've had a debate about defence spending, but certainly I'm always impressed by the work that people in the armed forces do. I think they are fit for whatever purpose they are sent out to do, whether or not they're properly resourced. And I have to say, despite the fact that we've been criticising the train drivers and the tube strikers, I get the tube every day. I do think that despite it being a Victorian system, the tube is a pretty good system in the end, and we all rely on it. Well, everybody in London relies on it very heavily. It does work on the whole, and it's very efficient. And so we complain about it, but it could be a lot worse.
Peter Bone.
Well, I think the vaccination programme, which was developed in this country, was delivered, and we had the booster programme. And I think the way the government led us through this dreadful pandemic shows things work. We have record employment, and in Wellingborough, we got a new hospital for my area. We just had a new prison built. We got a huge new leisure retail complex. Come to Wellingborough if you want to see how things are done properly.
I have been to Wellingborough before, but not for many years.
Come again. We'd love to have you in.
Angela.
Oh, I think what's most fit for purpose is Peter in defending the government. I was just thinking this is more about people, really, because you look around us and we've been through quite a torrid time. Whatever side you was on the Brexit debate, it was divisive, it was unpleasant, it was all-consuming in political life. We've then had the pandemic, which has really hurt people in business, socially. People have suffered a lot. So we're naturally not feeling in a great place at the moment. An interesting fact might bore the pants off you, but I'll tell you anyway. The most optimistic year...
That's always a good start to an answer, isn't it?
Bear with me. Most optimistic year in the last sort of 60-odd years was 1958. And that's when people felt more optimistic about the future. They'd come out of the war, they were going to raise families. I was conceived, so I was born in 59. But that was part of...
I should have been conceived in 1958 because my parents got married in that year and spent the first 4 years of their married life sleeping in a single bed. And it took them 4 years to have me.
Well, they might have needed lessons. But there was this mood of optimism, wasn't there? There was this mood of optimism. You're coming out of the war, homes were being built, people were getting jobs, it felt different. And I don't think people feel that optimism now. And that's the most important thing in this question, that is anything fit for purpose? There's lots of things that go quite well, usually because of the people that are running them. You mentioned the transport service. The people running those services do, all through the pandemic, the trains went on time, the tube was there, the health service was remarkable. People went to extraordinary lengths. I think they're let down by government, but what we need to do is get to a place where we get some optimism about the future again, because we carry on, I think, with this government, we're not going to have that optimism. We need to be actually investing ourselves, investing money, investing support in the future, so we can get these things up and running again in the way the public want them to, and do justice to the people working in those services.
OK, Lenny, can you answer your own question? Can you think of something that's fit for purpose in this country?
Well, I can't, Iain, really, because, how it came about was that even before the pandemic, I've made politics a little hobby of mine, and I used to speak on another radio station quite a lot, and I predicted the way our country was heading before the pandemic, and I was really frightened. And I said, this country is heading down the road that nothing's going to be fit for purpose. And I just wondered if you agreed with me if we finally got there.
Well, I think the jury's out of it. There are lots of things that don't work in this country, but you've heard a few things here from our panel that certainly do. Right, quick question from Jane in Sheffield. Sheffield Hallam University have decided to drop English literature as a subject they teach. What do the panel think of the systematic cutting of arts and humanities by the Tories in favour of STEM subjects? I always thought that, Sheffield Hallam used to be a polytechnic, didn't it?
It's now a university.
And so, therefore, back in the old days, they would have been expected to do more sort of vocational things. On the other hand, to cut English literature, Peter Bone, does seem an act of cultural vandalism.
Well, I don't know why they have. It doesn't explain why they decided to do that. Maybe people didn't want to go to Sheffield Hallam for it.
They'll lose money.
The government are giving them incentives to sort of prioritise scientific subjects.
Maybe there'll be plenty of English literature courses around the country to get. I just think, to me, that there's a lot of questions about universities at the moment, but not the variety of courses that are on offer.
Gordon?
I do think that there is probably a danger in all universities trying to offer all subjects. You sort of alluded to that. I think that there's no harm in having different universities that specialise in different things. I don't think we're going to be in a situation where you can't study English, and if you can't study it at Sheffield, well, I'm sure you can go somewhere else and study it. So I don't think it's a huge problem, but I do agree with you that cutting funding for subjects does seem rather sort of Orwellian.
You'd never guess that my producer Corey is from Sheffield, would you, Angela?
I was quite worried when I saw this, because I tried to find out a bit more about it, and it seems that if a university has a course and you haven't got at least 60% of the students going on and within 6 months getting a highly professional job, then they'll be penalised and lose money for future funding for that course. And yet, I don't know about your degree, Iain, but I'm one of the few people who have used mine in professional life. But most people, when they leave university, they don't immediately use the skills they've got at university. They use the sort of application to work, the whole range of things that they've done. It won't necessarily be their subject. And so the idea that you can cut a subject, especially something like English Lit, I find quite extraordinary. Most people also don't go into well-paying professional jobs straight from university. It often takes 2 or 3 goes to do that. So if you want to encourage people into other subjects, I'm very happy with that. Provide the funding, provide the support, look at the jobs we need for the future. But to actually penalise people on that basis doesn't seem to me it really hits the mark or does what it's intended to do.
I went to work in the House of Commons straight from university on a ground salary in 1985 of £6,000 a year. Gina Miller.
I was trying to find out a bit more about this as well, and I found it quite alarming because the 6 months I found very worrying, that it's only going to be 6 months. That seems a very short time to decide what you're going to do after you left university. And the other thing is, we are short of English teachers. We're actually short of teachers across the board. So again, that seems rather an odd decision. But it's much more fundamental than that, because even within schools, or secondary schools, we're seeing that there is a lack of support when it comes to, what's classic music, art, literature, and this huge focus on STEM, which there should be. But actually, education is more than that. It's about widening your understanding, bringing you culture, bringing you a sense of well-being and confidence. And if we just focus on academia and STEM, I think we'll lose that. So I do worry about the fragility and on the flip side of that, the confidence building in young people if we start just being so, transactional on education.
Thank you very much to all four of you, Baroness Angela Smith, Gina Miller, Peter Bone and Gordon Rayner. Coming up in a moment, we're going to turn our attention to defence cuts. We mentioned it in this hour. John Healey, who is Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary, he's called on Boris Johnson to halt the cuts to the UK's military in light of Vladimir Putin's assault on Ukraine. It's difficult to find an argument against that one, isn't it? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 2 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, a shopping centre's been hit by a Russian missile strike in central Ukraine, killing 11 people and injuring 40 others. Firefighters and soldiers are searching for survivors in the building in the city of Kremenchuk. NATO has revealed plans for the biggest overhaul